It was meant to be a historic day, Prince George stepping into legacy, honor, and destiny. Invitations were sent, protocols finalized, and the royal family quietly prepared for a moment that symbolized continuity. But behind palace doors, something shocking unfolded. Two names deliberately, unmistakably were missing, and what appeared to be a minor omission would soon ignite whispers of betrayal, power, and a silent war brewing within the monarchy itself. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, everything appeared perfectly aligned with tradition. This commissioning was not just another ceremony, it was a carefully crafted signal to the world that the next generation was ready to carry the weight of history forward. Prince George's step into naval life was meant to echo legacy, discipline, and duty, reinforcing the idea that continuity within the monarchy remained unbroken. Every name on that guest list mattered, every presence carried symbolic weight, and every detail had been reviewed with precision. Nothing was left to chance, or at least, that was what everyone believed. But then came the moment no one could explain. Quietly, almost too quietly, the absence was noticed. Princess Beatrice, Princess Eugenie, two figures who, despite the turbulence surrounding their family, had always remained tethered to royal life, loyal in their silence, present when it mattered. And yet, their names were not there. Not misplaced, not delayed, missing. Entirely. At first, it was dismissed as an oversight, a bureaucratic slip in an otherwise flawless operation. But that explanation didn't hold for long. Because within the palace, mistakes of that magnitude simply do not happen. The realization spread not through loud declarations, but through hushed conversations and lingering glances. Aides began retracing steps, double-checking documents that had already been finalized. Calls were made, questions were asked, but answers were strangely absent. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became. This was not an accident. This was intentional. And with that realization came something far more dangerous than confusion, tension. Behind closed doors, reactions began to fracture. Some defended the decision in silence, choosing loyalty to hierarchy over personal discomfort. Others felt the unmistakable shift, the sense that a line had been crossed without warning. Because excluding family, especially in a moment, meant to symbolize unity, was not just unusual, it was unprecedented. And in a family already strained by past controversies, the weight of that exclusion felt heavier than anyone was willing to admit out loud. Then came the whispers, not loud enough to be quoted, but sharp enough to carry meaning. This didn't come from protocol. It didn't come from oversight. It came from authority. And more specifically, it came from Prince William, the same figure who had long been seen as the steady hand guiding the monarchy into the future, had now made a decision that felt anything but neutral. It was calculated, precise, and deeply personal. And suddenly, the ceremony was no longer just about George. It became something else entirely, a quiet display of power, a message delivered without confrontation, yet impossible to ignore. Because in removing two names, William had done more than just a guest list. He had redrawn the boundaries of belonging. He had signaled without ever saying a word that proximity to the crown was no longer guaranteed by blood alone, and in doing so he had set something in motion that could not easily be undone. For Beatrice and Eugenie, the absence would not just be noticed, it would be felt deeply. And for those watching from the two, inside, it raised a question that lingered long after the lists were finalized and the invitations sealed. If this could happen here, at a moment so significant, then what else was already changing beneath the surface? Because sometimes, the most powerful decisions are not the ones announced, but the ones quietly enforced, leaving everyone else to deal with the consequences. And as confusion turned into quiet outrage, one question echoed behind closed doors: why would William take such a drastic step against his own cousins? For years, Prince William had remained composed, measured, almost untouchable in his public restraint. But this time, something was different. This wasn't diplomacy. This was a message, and it wasn't subtle. By excluding Andrew's daughters from one of the most significant royal milestones in decades, William wasn't just protecting tradition, he was redrawing the boundaries of power inside the monarchy. because this decision did not emerge from impulse, it came from evolution. A slow, deliberate transformation that had been unfolding behind the scenes, almost invisible to those who only watched the surface. William was no longer simply the future king waiting his turn. He had stepped into something far more active, far more decisive. Quietly, he had begun shaping the monarchy in his own image, tightening its structure, redefining who belonged within its core, and who, no matter their bloodline, would remain on the edges. And in that moment, with 2 names removed from a list that should have included them without question, the shift became undeniable. This was not just about attendance. It was about control. Within the palace, those who understood the deeper mechanics of power recognized exactly what had happened. The guest list for such an event was never a casual matter. It was reviewed, refined, and approved at the highest levels, often reflecting not just relationships, but priorities. And William's growing influence over these decisions had been building steadily. What once required consensus now increasingly bore his imprint. What once balanced tradition with sensitivity now leaned toward precision and calculation. The monarchy, as he seemed to see it, could no longer afford ambiguity. And so, the exclusion carried meaning far beyond the ceremony itself. It signaled a willingness to make uncomfortable choices, to prioritize the institution over individual ties, a message that even family could be repositioned, redefined, or quietly distanced if they no longer aligned with the vision being constructed. Because for William, the future was not just something to inherit, it was something to control. Behind closed doors, the conversations reflected this tension, not openly confrontational, but heavy with implication. There were those who understood his reasoning, who believed that protecting the monarchy required difficult decisions, even if they fractured personal bonds. But there were others who felt the weight of what was being lost in the process. Because this was not just strategy, it was separation, and once that line is drawn, it rarely disappears. At the heart of it all lay a deeper concern, one that had been quietly shaping William's choices. Legacy, not just his own, but George's. Every decision now seemed to orbit around a single question: what kind of monarchy would be left behind? And more importantly, what risks needed to be eliminated before they could threaten that future? In that context, the exclusion was no longer surprising, it was inevitable. Yet, even inevitability comes at a cost, because beneath the surface of calculated control, there remained something far more complicated: a conflict between duty and blood, between the need to protect an institution and the instinct to preserve family. And choosing one, William had undeniably sacrificed part of the other. The silence that followed his decision was not peace. It was tension, held tightly in place, waiting for the moment it would inevitably surface. And perhaps most striking of all was the sense that this was only the beginning. Small decisions often reveal larger patterns, and this one carried the unmistakable weight of something ongoing, a signal that future events, future appearances, and future roles would not be governed by tradition alone, but by a new, more controlled vision, one where inclusion was no longer automatic, and where proximity to power would be carefully, deliberately managed. Which raised a question no one inside the palace could fully ignore. If this line had been drawn now, in a moment meant to unite the family around the next generation, then how many more lines were already waiting to be drawn in the future? Because this decision didn't feel like an exception, it felt like a beginning. But this decision didn't happen in isolation. It was rooted in a history of tension that had been quietly building for years. Even when absent, some figures cast shadows too large to ignore. Prince Andrew may have stepped back from public life, but his presence still lingers in every corridor, every decision, every carefully managed appearance. And for William, that shadow wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Because as long as Andrew remained part of the narrative, so did the risk of everything unraveling. It was never just about one man. It was about what he represented, an unresolved chapter that refused to close, a stain that no amount of silence could fully erase. The monarchy had survived crises before, weathered storms that threatened to shake its foundations, but this felt different. This was not a single moment of controversy that could fade with time. It was a lingering presence, a it tension that resurfaced whenever the institution tried to move forward. And for those tasked with protecting its future, that uncertainty was not something they could afford to ignore. Behind the carefully controlled appearances, there had been a strategy subtle, calculated, and deliberately incomplete. The royal family had not severed ties completely, but they had stepped back, creating distance without declaration. It was a balancing act, one that required precision. Too much separation, and it would appear cold, even ruthless. Too little, and the risk of association would continue to haunt every public moment. So they walked a line, carefully, quietly, hoping it would be enough. But for William, enough was no longer acceptable. Because what had once been manageable had now become a liability. The world had changed. Scrutiny was sharper, judgment faster, and the margin for error almost non-existent. Every appearance, every decision, every association carried weight. And as he looked toward the future, not just his own, but George's, William saw something others were reluctant to confront. The past was not staying in the past, it was following them, waiting. And if left unaddressed, it had the power to resurface at the worst possible moment. That realization shifted everything. The burden placed on William was not simply to inherit the monarchy, but to stabilize it, to ensure that what had been damaged could be contained, controlled, and, if necessary, cut away. And that is where the conflict deepened, because this was not about removing a distant figure from public view. This was about dealing with the ripple effects, the family connections that remained, the ties that could not be erased without consequence. And at the center of that ripple stood Beatrice and Eugenie. They had not created the controversy. They had not chosen the circumstances that shaped their position. Yet, they carried the weight of it all the same. Every step they took, every appearance they made, was quietly measured against a past they did not control. And while they had remained composed, loyal, and careful, the shadow they lived under never truly disappeared. It followed them, shaping perceptions, limiting opportunities, and now defining their place within the family in ways that were impossible to ignore. For William, this was where the line blurred between personal and institutional. Compassion existed, it had to, but so did responsibility. And when those two forces collided, the outcome was never simple. Protecting the monarchy meant making decisions that felt unfair, even harsh. It meant recognizing that association alone could carry consequences, regardless of intent. And it meant accepting that some sacrifices would not be understood, not even by those most affected, because the fear was no longer hypothetical. It was real, immediate, and pressing. The idea that any lingering connection could undermine the future, George's future, was enough to push William toward decisions that once might have seemed unthinkable. This was no longer about avoiding controversy. It was about eliminating risk entirely, even if that meant drawing lines that would fracture relationships in the process. And so, the exclusion was no longer just a decision, it was a response. A calculated move shaped by years of tension, frustration, and unresolved consequences. A step taken not in isolation, but as part of a larger effort to redefine what the monarchy would carry forward and what it would leave behind. But while William saw a threat to the monarchy's future, for Andrew's daughters, the decision felt deeply personal and impossible to ignore. For years, they had remained loyal, quietly navigating the fallout of a scandal they didn't create. They stayed dignified, avoided controversy, and supported the crown when it mattered most. But this time, the silence broke. Because being excluded from Prince George's commissioning wasn't just a snub, it was a line crossed, a message received loud and clear. They were no longer considered part of the inner circle. At first, the reaction was disbelief. Not loud, not public, but deeply internal, because loyalty, in their world, was supposed to mean something. It was supposed to offer protection, a kind of unspoken assurance that no matter how turbulent the past became, those who stood firm would not be cast aside. And yet, in a single decision, that belief began to unravel, quietly, painfully, without warning. For Beatrice and Eugenie, this was not just about an event. It was about what the event represented. A moment of unity they had expected to be part of had instead become a moment of exclusion, and the silence surrounding it only made it worse. There was no explanation offered, no private reassurance, no attempt to soften the impact, just absence. Deliberate, unmistakable absence. Behind closed doors, the questions began. Not accusations at first, just confusion, searching for clarity where none was given. They reached out through familiar channels, the kind that had always existed within the palace, conversations that were meant to resolve misunderstandings, to correct mistakes before they became something larger. But this time, the responses were different, vague, careful, avoidant, and that was when the truth began to settle in. This wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. And once that realization took hold, the emotional shift was impossible to contain. Hurt gave way to something sharper, a quiet sense of betrayal that didn't need to be spoken out loud to be felt. Because this had come from someone they had once trusted, someone who, for years, had been seen not just as a future king, but as a steady presence within the family, an ally. And now, that perception was changing, not suddenly but undeniably, because exclusion of this magnitude does not happen without intention. It does not happen without awareness of its impact. And that was the part that lingered most, the understanding that this choice had been made with full knowledge of what it would mean, that it would hurt, that it would create distance, and that it would send a message that could not be ignored. For the first time, the dynamic had shifted. William was no longer simply a figure of unity in their eyes. He had become something else. A decision-maker whose priorities no longer aligned with theirs. Someone who had chosen the institution of, the individuals within it, even when those individuals had done everything expected of them. And in that shift, something fragile began to break. Because being overlooked is one thing, being deliberately excluded is another. The weight of that difference settled heavily, shaping not just how they felt in the moment, but how they began to see their place moving forward. Questions that had once seemed distant now felt immediate. Where did they stand? What role, if any, remained for them within a structure that appeared to be closing its inner circle? And perhaps most unsettling of all, was this the beginning of a pattern, or the confirmation of one already in motion? But the silence spoke loudly enough. And within that silence, something began to shift beneath the surface. Not open conflict, not yet, but the early signs of fracture. The kind that starts quietly, almost invisibly, before spreading into something far more difficult to contain. Because once trust is shaken, it rarely returns in the same form. And as those fractures began to form, the weight of the moment extended beyond personal hurt. It became something larger. A signal that the rules had changed, that loyalty was no longer enough, and that the lines within the family were being redrawn in ways that could not easily be undone. But while emotions ran high behind the scenes, the palace had a different priority controlling the narrative before it spiraled out of control. In the royal world, silence isn't accidental, it's engineered. As whispers of the exclusion began to circulate, palace officials moved swiftly, carefully crafting a narrative designed to deflect attention and avoid scandal. But behind the polished statements and carefully chosen words, a very different story was unfolding, one that couldn't be contained forever. The first response was almost predictable in its precis. Iron, calm, controlled, and deliberately unremarkable. The absence of Beatrice and Eugenie was framed not as exclusion, but as circumstance, scheduling conflicts, private commitments. Subtle phrasing designed to close the conversation before it could even begin. On the surface, it worked. For a moment, the story seemed contained, softened into something ordinary. But inside the palace, no one truly believed it would hold. Because the problem with carefully constructed silence is that it invites closer attention. Behind closed doors, briefings began almost immediately. Not loud, not urgent in tone, but urgent in intent. Staff were reminded firmly, quietly, of the importance of consistency. No speculation, no deviation. Every word aligned, every explanation controlled. The goal was simple: prevent the story from evolving beyond its initial framing, keep it contained, manageable, forgettable. But this wasn't a situation that could be easily simplified. Because while the official narrative suggested coincidence, the internal reality was far more complicated. Conversations that had taken place, decisions that had been weighed, The deliberate nature of what had happened, none of it aligned with the version being presented to the outside world, and that disconnect began to create something far more dangerous than the story itself. Doubt. It didn't appear all at once. It rarely does. Instead, it crept in through small inconsistencies. A detail that didn't quite match, a statement that felt too rehearsed, a silence where there should have been clarity. Those watching closely, those who understood how the palace operated, began to notice, and once noticed, it became impossible to ignore. Because when a narrative is too controlled, it raises a different kind of question. What are they trying to hide? To counter that growing curiosity, the palace shifted tactics. Attention was redirected. Other stories were elevated, carefully placed to occupy headlines and reshape focus. Public appearances were emphasized. Unity subtly projected through calculated visibility. The intention was clear. Move the conversation forward, away from the discomfort of unanswered questions and towards something easier to manage. But distraction only works when the underlying tension fades. And this tension wasn't fading. Internally, the pressure was building, not just from the situation itself, but from the effort required to contain it. Maintaining unity in public while navigating division in private is a delicate balance, one that becomes increasingly difficult as cracks begin to form. Because those within the system know the truth, and the longer that truth is suppressed, the more unstable the silence becomes. The risk was no longer hypothetical, it was immediate. All it would take was one voice, one insider willing to speak, to confirm what had been carefully hidden beneath layers of controlled messaging. And in an environment where emotions were already running high, where resentment, frustration, and quiet anger had begun to surface, that possibility felt closer than ever. Because silence, no matter how carefully engineered, is never permanent. And beneath the surface, something was shifting. The gap between what was being presented and what was actually happening had grown too wide to ignore. The narrative was no longer holding as firmly as it once had. Questions were lingering longer. Observations were becoming sharper, and the sense that there was more to the story, something deeper, something deliberately concealed, was beginning to take hold. Which meant the palace was no longer in full control, not completely. Because once doubt enters the conversation, it changes everything. It reshapes how every statement is received, how every silence is interpreted, how every scion is questioned. And in that environment, even the most carefully constructed narrative begins to weaken. And as that control started to slip, something inevitable began to happen. The truth, quiet, persistent, and impossible to fully suppress, started finding its way to the surface. And as the palace struggled to maintain control, the truth began to surface in ways no one had anticipated. It started with a whisper, an anonymous source, a single detail that didn't quite align with the official story. Then another, and another, and another, until suddenly the narrative shifted. What was once dismissed as speculation became undeniable because someone, somewhere inside the palace, had decided to reveal what really happened, and the fallout would be impossible to contain. At first, it was easy to ignore. A quiet murmur circulating beneath the surface, lacking the weight to disrupt the carefully maintained silence. But whispers, when persistent enough, have a way of finding direction. And this one did. It didn't stay contained. It moved through private conversations, through cautious exchanges, through those who knew just enough to recognize that something wasn't adding up. And then, almost without warning, it reached the outside. The first leak didn't expose everything. It didn't need to. It only needed to confirm what many had already begun to suspect, that the exclusion had not been accidental, not procedural, not misunderstood. It had been decided, deliberately. And more importantly, it had been directed. By William, that single detail changed everything, because once his involvement became more than rumor, the narrative could no longer be controlled in the same way. What had been framed as circumstance was now being questioned as strategy. And with that shift came something far more difficult to manage: momentum. Questions multiplied, speculation sharpened, and the space between why that was said publicly and what was believed privately began to collapse. Then came the second wave. More details, not broad, not dramatic, but precise, mentions of internal discussions, of conversations that had taken place behind closed doors. The kind of information that could only come from someone who had been there, or someone who had been told, and with each new detail, the picture became clearer. This had not been a last-minute adjustment. It had been considered, weighed, executed. The media, once cautious, began to shift its tone. Subtle at first, carefully worded questions, references to sources close to the situation, a growing willingness to challenge the official version of events. But the restraint didn't last long, because once a story begins to move, it rarely slows down. It accelerates, and the public followed. Curiosity turned into fascination, fascination into outrage, not just over the exclusion itself, but over what it represented: power, control, division. The idea that something deeper was unfolding within the monarchy, something that extended far beyond a single event. And suddenly, the story was no longer confined to insiders and observers. It had become a spectacle, one that demanded attention. Inside the palace, the impact was immediate. The carefully constructed silence had been broken, and in its place came pressure, not just from the outside, but from within. Because once information begins to leak, it changes the dynamic entirely. Trust becomes uncertain, conversations become guarded, and the awareness that someone, somewhere, is willing to speak creates a tension that cannot be easily contained. The stakes rose quickly. This was no longer about managing perception, it was about confronting reality. The monarchy, already navigating a fragile balance between tradition and modern scrutiny, now faced renewed questions about its internal structure, who holds power, how are decisions made, and perhaps most importantly, what happens when those decisions begin to fracture the very family they are meant to protect. For William, the consequences extended beyond the immediate fallout. His decision, once hidden behind layers of control, was now exposed to interpretation. Some saw strength, others saw calculation, and some saw something far more unsettling: a willingness to reshape the monarchy at any cost. And that perception, once formed, cannot be easily undone. Because stories like this don't fade quickly. They linger, they evolve, they invite deeper scrutiny with every passing moment. And as more voices began to question, to analyze, to speculate, one realization became impossible to ignore. This was no longer a contained situation. It had become something larger, something unpredictable. And as the world watched the drama unfold, one question became impossible to ignore. What did this mean for Prince George's future? At the center of it all stood a young prince meant to symbolize unity, continuity, and hope. But instead, Prince George found himself at the heart of a family conflict he never chose. A moment that should have been about honor and legacy had become something else entirely: a battleground for decisions made long before he ever had a voice. What was meant to be a defining step forward had quietly transformed into something far more complicated. The commissioning, designed to signal strength and continuity, now carried an undercurrent that could not be ignored. Because while the world saw ceremony, discipline, and tradition, those closer to the truth understood that something else had taken place beneath the surface. Something else had taken place beneath the surface, something deeply personal, something that would linger long after the moment itself had passed. And at the center of that storm stood George. He didn't create it. He died down, didn't influence it. Yet somehow he became its focal point. The symbolism of his role made that unavoidable. Every decision tied to him now carried amplified meaning. Every choice interpreted not just as a reflection of the present, but as a signal of the future. And in this case, that signal was layered with tension. Because what should have been a unifying moment had instead revealed division: quiet, controlled, but unmistakable. The pressure surrounding him was no longer just ceremonial. It was personal, even if he did not fully understand it yet. Because this moment was not only about stepping into responsibility, it was about inheriting the consequences of decisions made on his behalf. Decisions shaped by fear, by strategy, by a desire to protect something larger than any one individual. And while those intentions may have been rooted in caution, the impact was far more complex, because protection, when it comes at the cost of division, leaves behind questions that do not easily fade. For William, the justification was clear. even if unspoken, everything was being done with George in mind. His future, his stability, his position within an institution that had already faced too many challenges, too many moments where control slipped and consequences followed. In that context, the exclusion was not just a decision, it was a precaution, a way of shaping the environment around George, ensuring that his path forward would be as controlled, as protected, as carefully managed as possible. But protection has its own cost, because while the public saw celebration, those within the family felt the tension that had been quietly embedded within it, smiles that didn't fully reach their meaning, words that carried more weight than they revealed, a contrast between what was shown and what was felt, a divide between appearance and reality that could not be fully concealed. And within that contrast lay a deeper risk. Because moments like this do not simply pass, they leave impressions, they shape understanding, they influence how relationships are seen, how loyalty is defined, how decisions are interpreted. And for George, even if the full weight of it had not yet settled in, the foundation was being laid, a subtle awareness that family and institution do not always move in harmony, that sometimes they pull in different directions. And once that understanding begins to form, it cannot be undone. Because this would not be the last time he found himself at the center of such decisions. The path ahead, shaped by responsibility, expectation, and control, would continue to place him in positions where personal and institutional interests collided, where choices made for the sake of the monarchy would ripple through the family itself, creating tensions that could not always be resolved. And if this moment was any indication, those tensions were only just beginning, because what was presented as protection could, over time, become something else entirely, a pattern, a strategy, a way of defining the monarchy not just by what it preserves, but by what it chooses to leave behind. And that realization led to a question far more profound than the event itself. Because if this was how the future was being shaped carefully, strategically, and without hesitation, then what exactly was that future going to look like? But if this was meant to protect the future, it raised an even bigger question: what kind of monarchy was William truly building? This wasn't just about an invitation. It wasn't even just about family. It was about the future of the monarchy itself. Because in one calculated decision, Prince William revealed something far more significant than anyone expected: his vision for a streamlined, controlled, and uncompromising royal institution where loyalty would no longer be enough to secure a place within its inner circle. What had once been whispered as a possibility was now unfolding in real time. The idea of a slimmed-down monarchy had existed for years, often framed as modernization, efficiency, or adaptation to a changing world. But this felt different. This was no longer a quiet evolution. It was a decisive shift, a move from theory into action. And in that action, William made it clear that the monarchy he envisioned would not be bound by the same emotional considerations that had shaped it in the past. Because this was about control, not control in the sense of authority alone, but control over perception, over narrative, over who represented the institution and how they were seen. The monarchy, once defined by tradition and inherited roles, was now being reshaped by something far more strategic. Inclusion was no longer automatic. It was conditional, carefully measured against risk, relevance, and public image, and those who did not align with that vision, no matter their connection, could find themselves quietly repositioned. The implications of that shift extended far beyond this single moment, because if two members of the family could be excluded from such a significant event, then the boundaries of belonging had fundamentally changed. Other extended members, once secure in their roles, would now have to question where they stood. Not openly, not yet, but internally, with a growing awareness that the structure around them was no longer fixed. It was being redefined. And in a system built on hierarchy and expectation, that kind of uncertainty carries weight. But perhaps the most striking element of this transformation was not its strategy, it was its cost. Because every decision that strengthens an institution in one way can weaken it in another. Prioritizing image over connection, control over compass, Cheyenne, clarity over complexity, it creates a version of stability that is precise, but not necessarily unified. And within a family, unity has always been more than just symbolic. It has been the invisible thread holding everything together, even in times of tension. Now, that thread was being tested, because while William's approach may offer protection against external scrutiny, it introduces a different kind of vulnerability internally: resentment, distance, quiet fractures that do not immediately surface, but slowly reshape relationships over time. And once those fractures deepen, they become far more difficult to repair than any public perception ever could be. This is where the uncertainty begins to grow, because the question is no longer just about what William is building, it's about what might be lost in the process. A monarchy that is controlled, streamlined and carefully managed may appear stronger on the surface, but strength without cohesion carries its own risks, and history has shown, time and again, that internal division can be just as destabilizing as external pressure. And yet, from William's perspective, the path may feel justified, because leadership, especially at this level, often requires decisions that are not easily understood in the moment, decisions that prioritize long-term stability over immediate harmony, that accept discomfort as the price of control, and that redefine tradition in order to preserve relevance. In that sense, this was not just a reaction, it was a declaration, a clear indication of how the monarchy would move forward under his influence. But declarations, no matter how carefully constructed, always carry consequences. And those consequences are rarely immediate. They unfold gradually, shaping the future in ways that cannot always be predicted. Because once a new direction is set, it begins to affect everything: relationships, expectations, perceptions, even the very identity of the institution itself. And as that direction becomes clearer, one thought lingers just beneath the surface. Is this transformation the key to securing the monarchy's future, or the beginning of a deeper divide that will define it? And as the dust begins to settle, one final question lingers: has William secured the future, or quietly ignited a conflict that will define it? The ceremony ended, the headlines moved on, but beneath the surface, nothing was resolved. Because some decisions don't fade, they echo. And what began as a single exclusion has now become something far more dangerous: a fracture that refuses to heal, quietly reshaping the royal family in ways no one can fully control. What lingered was not noise, but silence, the kind that carries weight, the kind that settles into conversations left unfinished, and glances that say more than words ever could. Because while the public moment had passed, the private consequences had only just begun to unfold. And within those quiet spaces, tension remained, not explosive, not immediate, but steady, persistent, waiting. Between William and Andrew's daughters, something had shifted in a way that could not easily be reversed, not because of a single decision, but because of what that decision represented: a boundary drawn, a message delivered. And once understood, it changed everything. The familiarity that once defined their connection now carried hesitation, the ease replaced by something more cautious, more guarded, because trust, once questioned, rarely returns in its original form. And the uncertainty did not stop there, because if this could happen once, it could happen again. That realization began to ripple outward, touching not just those directly involved, but others within the extended circle. Future events, future roles, future invitations. Nothing felt entity, rely certain anymore. The structure that once seemed stable now felt fluid, shaped not only by tradition, but by decisions that could shift without warning. And in that uncertainty, a quiet tension began to settle across the family, one that could not be openly acknowledged, yet could not be ignored. Behind closed doors, relationships began to adjust. Conversations became more measured, reactions more restrained, not because the emotions had lessened, but because they had deepened. Because what had taken place was not just a moment, it was a signal, and signals once received have a way of influencing everything that follows. Outside those doors, the fascination did not fade. If anything, it grew. Because the absence of resolution created space for speculation, for interpretation, for a narrative that refused to settle. The public, drawn to the idea that something deeper was unfolding, continued to watch, to question, to connect the pieces in ways that only added to the sense of something unfinished. And the more attention it received, the harder it became to contain. which left the monarchy in a position it could not easily define, caught between unity and division, between control and consequence, between a future being carefully constructed and a present that refused to fully align with it, because while the intention may have been clarity, the result was something far more complex, a moment that did not close, but instead opened a new chapter, one marked not by resolution, but by uncertainty. And perhaps that is what makes it most significant, because this will not be remembered as an isolated event. It will be seen as a turning point, a moment where something shifted beneath the surface, quietly but permanently, where the balance between family and institution was tested in a way that revealed just how fragile that balance can be. And yet, even now, nothing is true, lie settled, because unresolved tensions do not disappear. They evolve, they resurface, they shape the decisions that come next, often in ways that cannot be predicted. And in a system as complex as this, where every action carries meaning, those unresolved threads have a way of weaving themselves into the future, which means this story is not over, not even close. Because in the world of royalty, the most dangerous battles are never the ones we see, they're the ones still waiting to unfold. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.